Turkey is an enemy in the sense that the basic interests of Turkey, as they are perceived by the leadership in Turkey today, clash with the very basic interests of Israel, and therefore we have a structural problem far beyond this or another incident or clash here or there. Turkey is bad news all around.
Professor Dan Schueftan is one of Israel's most respected and most outspoken strategic thinkers. When we last spoke, much of our conversation focused on Iran. But today, I want to focus primarily on another power whose influence is rapidly expanding around Israel, Turkey. This is no longer a theoretical discussion. Last week, Israel bombed the Abu al-Dahur air base in Syria amid concerns that Turkey was preparing to expand its military presence there. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel will not tolerate a Turkish military establishment in Syria that it threatens Israel. Turkey rejected Israel's accusations. Professor Schueftan, just a few weeks ago, you described Turkey as an enemy of Israel, a very dangerous enemy of Israel in every aspect except the military. Israel has now bombed Syria precisely because it fears Turkish military entrenchment there. Professor Schueftan, are Israel and Turkey now beginning to cross into an actual military rivalry? What are your thoughts on that situation?
No, I don't think this is happening. We are not about to have a military confrontation with Turkey. Remember, Turkey is a member of NATO. I don't think it's in the cards either for Turkey or for Israel. But Turkey and Israel have conflicting interests in the region. And let me point at one of them that is particularly important in the long term, beyond the immediate problems that we are having in Syria, in Gaza, and in other places. Turkey wants to be the exclusive route for energy and information and goods coming from the East towards Europe and the Western world in general. And now, particularly after the problems of the Straits of Hormuz, there is a much stronger pressure in the direction, I think a very positive direction, where you can bypass the Chinese and radical elements by creating a chain of supplies that starts from India, goes through the United Arab Emirates and over Saudi Arabian territory to Haifa, and you can have goods there, you can have oil coming there directly from the Gulf to the Eastern Mediterranean. We are speaking also about the information route. We are underestimating the fact that cyber today is a very important element, and we are used to getting it, through Wi-Fi and wireless in a wireless way. But you need very massive wiring in order to take information on a very large scale through continents and countries. And the route this will go through is very, very important. Turkey wants to have a monopoly of everything that goes from the east to the west. First of all, the oil that is going from the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus through Turkey into Europe. Second, they want also resources from the Eastern Mediterranean, gas from Eastern Mediterranean going through Turkey. They want the entire route that I've described before, after it goes through Saudi Arabia, to go either directly to Turkey or through Syria, that will be under Turkish, not sovereignty, but Turkish influence. The Turks want to hegemonize Turkey. And actually, there is a similar problem that Turkey has with Israel that Iran has with Israel. Iran wanted to hegemonize the Middle East, and when it tried to hegemonize the Middle East and had these pacts with radical forces in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, trying to get a foothold in Jordan, trying as far as Morocco to have their roots in these areas, they realized that in the Middle East there is only one power that is both strong enough and determined enough to stand in their way, because we are speaking about radical forces. Israel is the ultimate enemy of radicalism in the region, and whereas the Europeans are so irresponsible that they're doing nothing about what is threatening them. And the Americans sometimes take the dumbest approach to dealing with radicals. We've seen it with Obama. We've seen it on a lesser extent with the Biden administration. So the Americans are very strong, but they're not determined. The Israelis are both strong and determined. So if you want to hegemonize the Middle East from a Iranian point of view, Israel is your major obstacle. So in addition to the Jew hatred and the anti-Semitism and the obsession with Israel that you have in parts of the Muslim world, you also have a very sound strategic consideration saying whatever is bad for Israel is good for Iran because Iran wants to hegemonize the region. Now you have something similar with Turkey. They go in different directions. They go as far as Somalia in Africa. They are willing to go to many places. They already have very strong relations with Azerbaijan that was also built on ethnic relations. And they want to establish themselves as the major power in the Eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Middle East and parts of Africa. And the one power that stands in their way is Israel. Now it is not so much because you have radical forces, but it is primarily because they want to they want to hegemonize economically the Eastern Mediterranean. The Turks and the Libyans, one of the governments in Libya, have already established a link between them, and they're claiming exclusive economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean at the expense of Egypt and Cyprus and Israel and Greece, and they want to establish themselves there. As I mentioned before, they want the energy and information route to go either through Turkey or through a country that is hegemonized by Turkey. At the moment, they're thinking about Syria. So the only major obstacle, the only force that can really contain the Turkish pressure is Israel. Add to it the fact that he is very close, Erdogan is very close to the Muslim Brotherhood, and his regime is very close to the Muslim Brotherhood. His Jew hatred very deeply entrenched there. And you have a very radical power inside Turkey. You see, Mustafa Kemal 100 years ago managed to civilize, to bring stronger to Western civilization about 30%, perhaps 40% of the Turks. But if you go to Anatolia, to the primitive population, there you have the kind of Islam that is not open to adjust itself to the challenges of the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. The problem is not Islam, the different kinds of Islam in the world, but here in Turkey, you have, with the support of Erdogan and his regime, the most incompatible part of Islam in terms of fitting into the 20th and 21st century. So you have a combination of reasons, and I'm saying wherever Israel goes, as far as Somalia, wherever Israel goes, they will find the Turks on the wrong side, particularly as supporters of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, as supporters of a kind of Syria that will be a challenge to Israel. And what the Turks want is not a confrontation with Israel in Syria. What they want is a Turkish position that will weaken Israel, because whatever is bad for Israel is good for Turkey in their perception. So that Israel will not have a route open to attack Iran when it is absolutely necessary to respond to the fact that the Iranians are attacking Israel with missiles, but Israel is attacking primarily with aircraft, and they need to fly over Syria. So Turkey wants to have in Syria air defense systems that will undermine the Israeli position, not because Turkey wants it, but because they want to deny it to Israel, because for them, whatever weakens Israel is good for Turkey, because we have a very tough competition that is supported by an ideological hatred of Jews, anti-Semitism of the worst kind of Erdogan and the kind of people that support him in Turkey. Remember also, Erdogan radicalized Turks in Europe. You have millions of Turks in Germany and they used to be not fully integrated in Germany, but at least a positive element, no threat to Germany, like immigrants from Afghanistan and part of the immigrants from Syria. And now, in the last elections in Turkey, the Turkish citizens of Germany who have dual nationality and they can vote in the Turkish election, a higher proportion of Turks in Germany supported Erdogan than the proportion of Turks in Turkey that supported Erdogan. So what you have is a problem of radicalizing the Turks in Europe. And Erdogan is using the population as a weapon against Europe to extort Europe. It threatens Europe. If you don't give me billions of dollars, I will open the floodgates and immigrants will come from Turkey into Europe. He is working with Turks in Europe in a way that they can be weaponized against their host countries. We are speaking about a barbaric regime, not as bad as the Iranians, but also with similar attitudes. And again, you must learn about the very strong association that Turkey has with the Muslim Brotherhood, about what kind of problem you can have that at the moment it looks benign, but very soon it becomes malignant. If you look at what Erdogan presented when he came to power in the beginning of this century, it looked like a benign Muslim identity that can coexist with the West, and it became more malignant, first vis-a-vis Israel, and also the potential of this getting worse vis-a-vis Europe, so that we have a very major problem there. To sum it up, I would say the following. Turkey is an enemy in the sense that the basic interests of Turkey, as they are perceived by the leadership in Turkey today, clash with the very basic interests of Israel, and therefore we have a structural problem far beyond this or another incident or clash here or there. At the moment, it is not on the military level, but the very fact that Turkey has a very large military, and in certain aspects it is a relatively modern army, not as modern and sophisticated as the Israeli, but also with a very strong military industry that can adjust itself to developments in the battlefield. Turkey is bad news all around.
Do you think Turkey is replacing Iran as Israel's central strategic problem? Meaning Iran's capabilities and regional proxy network have been badly degraded, while Turkey, as we mentioned, is expanding politically, economically, militarily, looking 10 years ahead. Which one worries you more, Iran or Turkey? And could Turkey ultimately be more dangerous than Iran because of its membership with NATO and its close ties to America?
Well, unfortunately, being an enemy of Israel is not mutually exclusive. Everybody could be the enemy of Israel. Look what's happening today, when I think that part of the American Jewish community, the ones that support Mandani, are enemies of Israel, or at least adversaries of Israel. So it can even extend to places that you don't. Let me put it this way. The late Bernard Lewis, perhaps the best scholar we've had of Middle Eastern affairs and a lover of Turkey, said one day Iran may become Turkey and Turkey may become Iran. And again, it can happen at the same time. At the moment, both are hostile, but they present very different kinds of challenges because Turkey still has its European contacts. On the one hand, it is restraining what Turkey is doing vis-a-vis Israel. On the other hand, it makes it more capable. And of course, the Europeans will always be on the wrong side. This is systematic. That's the only constant you can rely on. You know, they come to Ankara and they praise Erdogan while he's occupying a territory of the European Union in northern Cyprus. And then they use the worst possible words vis-a-vis Israel, and they're trying to enforce on Israel something that for Israel could become a threat with existential dimensions, trying to impose on Israel a Palestinian state, an independent Palestinian state at this stage. So you are having special problems with the Turks, and some things that make their threat less immediate and less dangerous. These are different kinds of enemies, but at the moment, they're both enemies. And by the way, if you want some historic irony, in the 1950s, Israel relied on Turkey and Iran against the Arab world. Today, we have a community of interest with most Arab states, and the two non-Arab Middle Eastern powers are hostile to Israel. We also, in the 1950s and the 1960s, our friends in Europe were the socialists and the left-leaning liberals, and today they became our worst enemies. The more to the left you go in Europe, in most countries, you will have more hostility towards Israel. So sometimes friends and enemies change because you're speaking about political partners and political opponents, and friendship has nothing whatsoever to do with it.
Now, is Erdogan's campaign against Israel a reaction to October 7th and Netanyahu, or does it go back to further than that? Right.
It goes back to the structural clash between what is perceived on both sides as the most important national interest. On top of it, there is this sick anti-Semitism of Erdogan and the fact that it benefits him domestically vis-a-vis a very anti-Jewish, very anti-Semitic public opinion in Turkey, and particularly among his supporters, namely in Anatolia, the lower echelons of the Turkish people. There you have the kind of anti-Semitism that is encouraged by Erdogan, and it flourishes, and they feed each other. Public opinion and Erdogan feed each other with anti-Semitism.
Does Erdogan actually want Israel destroyed, or does he want an Israel weak enough that Turkey can dominate it strategically?
Look, he wants Israel weak enough that he can dominate the region. And if he wants it destroyed or not, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. The question of what he wants, his mother should be more interested in it than I am.
Do you think the problem is Erdogan or the problem is Turkey? Meaning, if he leaves,
the problem is Turkey beyond Erdogan, because you see, he has already replaced the existing, to some extent, the existing middle class in the Turkish society with his kind of people. So traditional, in the bad sense of the term, traditional can also be positive, but in his case, it is, in Turkey's case, these are the kinds of forces that you don't want to see in the modern world. Again, his association with the spirit of the Muslim Brotherhood is important here. Muslim Brotherhood is what brought down large portions of the Arab world to a position where they are inferior because of their inability to deal with the challenges, again, of the 20th century. Forget the 21st century. If today countries like Egypt don't have a future, and I'm sorry to say it, I wish Egypt could become the anchor of Middle Eastern stability, because it is, 90% Sunni Muslims and the 10% Copts fit into the Egyptian society. And you could have Egypt as the anchor of stability, but Egypt is on the verge of hunger, and nobody has an answer to 120 million Egyptians who don't belong in the 21st century, unfortunately. And the reason is it is very strongly associated with the fact that if you had free elections in Egypt today, the Muslim Brothers would have been elected. They were elected a decade and a half ago. Only the military rule of Sisi saved the Middle East from Egypt being dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is this spirit that makes it impossible for a country to deal with its problems and brings up radicalism and produces the inevitable failure of these societies. Look what happened in the Middle East during the so-called, did they come out of trouble, or did they make their troubles even deeper and less open to some kind of positive response of nation building and society building? Unfortunately, it made things worse, because the problem in the Middle East is not with the leadership, it is with the society. The problem is not that you have some corrupt leaders who are dictators, and once the beauties of Arab society come to the fore when they overthrow their leaders, then everything will be developing in the right direction. Again, look at the Arab Spring, look at what happened, and I don't think it is an accident. And by the way, in the only place where people had some hope that it can improve in a major way, namely in Tunisia, what made it impossible were the Muslim Brothers. And if I may, something completely as a sideline, this is the same problem we have with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. They're the Jewish brothers. The same problem that you have there at the moment, since they are a minority, they can have a parasitic life at our expense. But if they take over the society by virtue of their numbers, then we will have another failing state in the Middle East. And again, it's the same sentiment, the inability to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. And Arabs can deal with it, and Turks can deal with it. Mustafa Kemal proves that Turks can very successfully deal with it, and the United Arab Emirates demonstrates how an Arab society can deal with it very well. The question is, which part of the society dominates the collective, the public life, the collective of these countries? And when you have something like the Muslim Brotherhood, or something like the kind of regime you have today in Turkey, then the failure is inevitable.
Israel says an imminent Turkish military establishment was being prepared at the Syrian airbase. Tom Barak has openly questioned the Israeli assessment. How much evidence should Israel require before it attacks a neighboring country because of a capability that does not yet exist?
First of all, I wouldn't trust anything that Tom Barak says. He works for Erdogan. He is the advocate of Erdogan, and I don't think he has anything analytical to contribute. Whatever is good for Erdogan, he will support. And I think that he doesn't have America's interest in mind. He has the Erdogan interest in mind. So what he says is irrelevant. And the evidence that Israeli intelligence has is very solid. And we shouldn't be looking at intelligence the way we look at, judicial questions, as if, do you really have evidence beyond any kind of doubt that something is happening? It is solid enough for every action, and the evidence is there. We presented it to the Americans, and look, whoever doesn't want to believe in it, let him not believe in it. I think that trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced is a waste of time. If you see what Israel is accused of, 90% of what Israel is accused of is so ridiculous that it's not even worth a response. It is simply a product of hatred, and it shouldn't be taken seriously. And I don't just mean what, people in North Korea or in Gaza say, even when it comes to the New York Times. I mean, if you want to believe that Israel is training dogs to rape Palestinian prisoners, then you're sick, and you don't have any kind of discussion that you can have with people who are willing to entertain elements of the blood libel. For instance, Israel is presented as a country where people get up in the morning to kill babies and so on, and there is no point. I think we should realize there is hostility. We have learned for thousands of years how to deal with it. We shouldn't take it seriously. Now, does it mean that Israel doesn't make mistakes? No, it does make mistakes. Does it mean that Israelis cannot commit crimes? No, Israelis commit crimes and they belong in jail. And if they do it, Israelis are human and they have shortcomings like other human beings. But these kind of automatic allegation or negation of what Israel is saying, okay, when it comes from Tom Barak, I will not even waste my time trying.
Now, you've argued that after October 7th, Israel must stop waiting for radical enemies to become ready for war, that it should destroy threatening capabilities while they're still being constructed. But Turkey creates a problem for that doctrine. Turkey is not Hamas.
I was very specific when I said it. I said when it comes to Arab countries, we have basically an answer for Arab countries arming themselves. Namely, when we arm ourselves, we use the time better, and they're arming themselves, and we can maintain the gap in our favor by using the time better. I spoke about radical forces, not about countries like Egypt or, for that matter, Turkey. I spoke about the Palestinians in Gaza or elsewhere. I spoke about Hezbollah. I spoke about the Houthis and so on. And I said Israel must adopt a policy, and we are pursuing a policy of violent maintenance where we don't wait for them to be ready. Now, when it comes to Turkey, it is not that Turkey becomes stronger, but that Turkey becomes closer to Israel. And here, what we did in this airport is exactly this policy. We will not wait for them to entrench themselves, to bring surface to air missiles to this place, to disrupt our freedom of action vis-a-vis Iran, and then respond to it. Once we find out that this is what they're doing, then we should indicate that we're willing to destroy it, as we did this time, and therefore prevent it, for a while at least, or actually destroy it if it comes into being. And this is not to say that when the Turks say build a very big navy, we will sink this navy because one day it will attack Israel. It is not vis-a-vis Turkey, it is vis-a-vis what Turkey is doing in Syria.
Now, I want to just give you one hypothetical, but suppose the next installation that Israel believes it must destroy has Turkish military personnel inside.
So
Should
let's
Israel
try
still
to
attack?
do it. No, Israel should try to do it when the personnel is not present. Okay, then you find now we are going into tactical problems. Do you do it during the day or do you do it at night? Do you see to it that the barracks are not bombarded, but the installations are bombarded when they're not manned and so on? Of course, we should try to be careful in order not to provoke the Turks unnecessarily. We provoke them necessarily, but not unnecessarily. And second, because we don't want to give the Americans a problem because they want to work with the Turks. So these are tactical questions. How do you do it in the most effective way? Do you do it immediately or somewhat later? Do you do it during the day or during the night? So you can speak to somebody who wastes his time discussing tactical matters, or not wasting his time, but doing his job, discussing tactical matters, because he has to make the decisions of how to implement a good strategy in an appropriate tactical way. That's not my expertise, and I don't think we should go into the tactical details here.
The only reason I said that was because if, let's say, Turkish soldiers die, then Erdogan must most probably retaliate for that. So that's
So let's
really
try
why
not.
I'm.
So let's try not to kill them.
Okay. Now, my next question is you've been very critical of the Trump Erdogan relationship, as you should be. What do you think that Trump sees in Erdogan that maybe we're not seeing? And what does Erdogan understand about Trump that gives him so much confidence? Is he playing him? What's the relationship there like?
No, Trump has a kind of affinity that I'm not professionally qualified to explain to people like Kim Jong-un and like Erdogan, and haters of Netanyahu say like Netanyahu as well. Okay, but I mean, actually, dictators, I don't think it applies to Netanyahu. It's a different story. Dictators who can deliver, who can dictate everything because Trump wants to dictate everything. So, again, I'm not professionally qualified to discuss it, but I think that he misunderstands the radicalism of Erdogan. Americans have consistently a problem with understanding radicals because they believe people become radicals because they couldn't get what they wanted in a legitimate way, so they turn to the illegitimate way. And if you give them what they want legitimately, they will moderate. I don't know. I don't really care what the deep psychological reason for it is, as you know, Trump is not motivated by a well-organized ideology or a very elaborate strategic super picture of reality and so on. He is working on the basis of his instincts. Very often his instincts are very good, like they were when he brought about the Abraham Accords. And sometimes they're good, like they were when he participated in the Israeli action in June and destroyed the nuclear or hit the nuclear facilities. And sometimes these instincts are in the wrong direction when he capitulated to Iran in April, May, June 26. And with Erdogan and with other dictators, he feels comfortable. We need to look at the outcome. It is a given from an Israeli point of view that Erdogan and Trump work well together. And I don't think that finding out what exactly brought to it is something that I can do.
Now, I spoke to an expert last week, and he basically told me that Turkey is one of the biggest financiers of Hamas operations in Gaza. And this financial activity on this scale could not take place without the Turkish government's knowledge. Also, Israeli intelligence has repeatedly linked Hamas networks in Turkey to financing recruitment and plots targeting Israelis. How concerned should we be about Turkey's role in helping Hamas in Israel?
We should be concerned about it. It is true that it is happening, and it's an uphill battle because, A, there is an enormous amount of sympathy for Hamas in Turkey from Erdogan down, and not just Erdogan himself, but his people, his institutions, and what have you. And it's a problem, and we should be aware of it. By the way, Erdogan has his own problems, and if his support of Hamas go too far, I think there are a few things that Israel could do that Israel is not doing at the moment.
And we just saw a new Sunni alignment between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Is that something historic, or is that just an exaggeration of how important this pact is between them?
I don't think this pact is very important. First of all, in saying that this is like NATO and Article 5 in NATO, and they will come to help each other, that's ridiculous. This will not happen. If Iran attacks Saudi Arabia tomorrow, then Turkey will make war on Iran. By the way, I would enjoy an Iranian-Turkish war. It would be a lot of fun. It would be almost as good as the Iraq-Iran war, which I enjoyed very much at the time. I was really hoping that both of them will succeed. And in the true spirit of sportsmanship, I believe that it is the game rather than the outcome. And I was very sorry that it ended. And if the Turks and the Iranians fight each other, they both have my blessings, and one of them will become weaker. I will be delighted to help them so that they can continue. Unfortunately, it will not happen. In other words, I don't think that Turkey will attack Iran when Iran attacks Saudi Arabia. There is a much more important and serious link between Pakistan and Iran, and probably the Saudis have paid to some extent for the Pakistani nuclear project, and the Pakistanis are willing to extend some of the deterrence of their nuclear capability to Saudi Arabia, and they cooperate militarily and they can work together. So on the Saudi Pakistani level, I would take it somewhat more seriously. In terms of the Turkish participation, I don't see it as something groundbreaking that will change the Middle East.
I want to move to Iran. Nearly 6 months into the Iranian conflict, much of Iran's conventional military capacity has been degraded, its regional network badly damaged, but the regime is still there. What is your assessment of where we stand right now in this war? And what does victory actually mean?
Anybody who wastes his time about a discussion of what victory really means should find a more productive entertainment than this. You achieve your objectives cumulatively. It may take decades, it may take generations. Think of how long it took to bring the Soviet Union down, and you never know when it's happening. When it's happening, you'll be surprised. When it's not happening, you'll be surprised. And by the way, not just bringing down the regime. When the Arab Spring erupted, it surprised us. Had it not erupted, we would be surprised that it is not erupting. These are things that are very, very difficult to predict. But should we make the life in Iran miserable? Yes. Should we undermine Iran? Yes. Could it bring down the regime one day? Yes. Is it important that Iran, whatever is bad for Iran, is bad for all the good guys? Is good for all the good guys. I mean, not just for Israel, for the United States, for Europe. The Europeans don't know what's good and bad for them, so they don't really matter. They're not players. They work very hard in becoming insignificant in world affairs. And I don't know. I know that whatever weakens Iran is good for practically everybody. The question is, can we prevent them from becoming a nuclear power? And this depends to a very large extent on the United States and also on Israel, because for Israel, it's an existential threat. We are speaking about barbarians. We are speaking about people who, even if they don't use nuclear weapons, they will use it to become immune when they prepare other things that will undermine our very existence. So it is something that Israel must take very seriously. And at the moment, we depend on the United States. I hope that the American sanction regime will indeed be effective, and it takes a lot of time. By the way, the Biden administration said, look, what Trump did not work with the sanctions. It's because the Biden administration stopped the sanctions that they didn't work. I mean, the Biden administration is responsible for the welfare of the Iranian regime, like Obama was responsible for it, because they don't understand that whatever the Iranians can agree to is bad for the United States. And therefore, the agreement between the United States and Iran now, the Memorandum of Understanding, was catastrophic. If the Iranians can accept something, we shouldn't accept it. There is no way you can reach with them anything that is acceptable to the West. If they agree to something, we were fooled. We have failed. So pressure and more pressure, military pressure at the moment, not realistic at least until the midterm elections, economic pressure, any other kind of pressure, any other kind of activities against the Iranians. Again, whatever is bad for Iran is enormously important for Western civilization. The Europeans are not willing to do anything. I mean, being impotent is the only thing they can be proud of. And the United States, unfortunately, like Europe, does not have the popular will to fight for essential things for freedom in the world. And we have a major problem because this is the attitude not only of public opinion in Europe, but also public opinion in the United States.
Now, I want to ask one last question. Right now, we're seeing the election period in Israel. Let's say, assuming Netanyahu doesn't win, if somebody else comes into power, will that change Israel's strategy when it comes to fighting its enemies? Should be concerned about that.
Not in a major way. Israelis, and this is a consensus that is very, very wide in Israeli society, realize that containment is not an option, that what I call violent maintenance is absolutely necessary, that we cannot afford, even people like me who are eager to get out of the Gaza Strip and eager to get out of the overwhelming majority of the West Bank. Even people like me realize that at the moment, establishing an independent Palestinian state will bring Iran to 15 kilometers from Tel Aviv and will bring Afghani militias into these areas and Hamas to control this Palestinian state, and then perhaps even Irish forces protecting the terrorists from Israeli retaliation or something. So we know that all this bullshit, if you pardon my academic expressions, about Europe speaking for a Palestinian state that they recognize and so on, the overwhelming majority of Israelis understand that this is ridiculous. I'm delighted to say that progressives in Israel have committed electoral suicide. They're not even represented in the Knesset. What we call left in Israel, the Yair Golan party, I may disagree with them on this or that issue, but basically they're not willing to even approach the kind of ridiculous advice Israel gets from Europe or from the Democratic Party in the United States. And I think the distinction in policy will not be major. Here and there, you have a person less experienced, more experienced, tougher here, tougher there, softer here, softer there, minor issues. When it comes to the mainstream of Israelis and the most important decisions in Israeli national security, we will have similar things.
Well, that's great to hear. Professor Schueftan, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you.